And it's wonderful to come here to this university with you, brought, however, by Delisa, and we started talking last year, was it last year, I think, about coming? So I'm really grateful to be here, to be able to share some of the things that I have learned on my own trail, writing and researching this book, Black Indian, which is a family memoir, very much so, but it's also an institutional racism memoir, also talking about classification, reclassification of people of color in this country, and how mixed raciality presented for some people a problem, and then for others it was something that we had to hold on to and carry no matter what happened in our lives. Am I speaking loud enough? Oh, okay. Maybe I can talk. Can you hear me on this one as well? Okay, fantastic. Oh, great. Okay, lovely. Let me turn this one off. So again, the song that I sang, I've been more on the trail. When I say traditionalist, it means I've been participating in ceremonies for 30 years, since my daughter was 9, in fact. That's when we went to our first sweat lodge. And, wait, I'm sorry, back up, not 30, 28, okay, 28 years. And we went to the first sweat lodge when she was 9 years old. And in fact, that's when she first started doing things that people would do when you go to these kinds of communities, like teaching the young people how to keep fire, and teaching us songs, and teaching us what is a good way to ask something, and then when to stay silent and when to learn. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about today are some of the things that I learned as a budding traditionalist, and then also on the trail for the last 28 years. The hidden heritage of Afro Indigenous peoples in America is such a tapestry of this country. In fact, when people start talking about their own fields of expertise, I always see where we fit in. I see where what some people would call us free people of color, or Black, or Negro. And in my mind, I'm starting to identify the places in which laws were changed to transfer or translate a name from a Black slave, or quote unquote Negro, into free people of color, and then how the free people of got cut off, and then it just became colored, which became synonymous with, for some reason, all Black people. But I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. So what is a Black Indian? And I liked it when people ask me. I said, okay, let me actually give you some identifiers of what makes a Black Indian or an Afro-Indigenous, or sometimes we call ourselves Red Black. So it is someone who has documented ethnicity or documented information that says your people were Indian. So for example, if it's a World War I or World War II record, if it is a birth certificate, any kind of land deed that says in, say for example, when the census was created in 1790, it was created really to start to count things like cows and land that you had, and how many people were in your house. And suddenly the US Census became a way of counting, of course, your slaves, your property, and then it became a way of erasing indigeneity. So whereas you might have a Tuscarora in someone's house in 1790, in the 1800s or 1810, you could have an other. And there were moments in state census, North Carolina, Virginia, South Carolina, and then the US Census, when you could see every 10 years there was erasure happening. We call that paper genocide. I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. But if you have some of these records where you see that your people identified as Indian, no one was telling them not to at the time, right? How many people actually have seen Indian on any of their family records or any deeds or anything like that? Has anyone seen the word Indian? 1, 2 people, okay, 3 folks. And then the rest, maybe you haven't gone back far enough if you believe that you have some of this heritage and ethnicity. And then maybe others, you maybe actually don't have it, but you've got a different kind of connection, which is number 2, which is that oral history, right? So how many of you have heard that you have some Indian in you? That's how we say it. Somebody said, I have some Indian in us, yes, right? And so that's one of the ways that we have continued to kind of propel our oral history and oral narrative forward, because someone said, you know your great-great-grandmother, have you seen her hair, that good Indian hair, that long hair? Have you seen the nose? And you've got her cheeks. And so it became a physicality, right? It became the sense of, you look Indian, so you've got to be Indian. But then no one kind of looked at the Afro in them or the Seminole, and how the Seminole were kind of, depending on the tribe of the Seminole, some could be short and dark, some could be a little taller and more muscular, right? So you can't always tell by the physical attributes of someone as to whether or not they're indigenous. But that oral history is something that you can hold on to and then research later. And so people have been saying that, which is something that happened in my family. And in my book, I have a section where I talk about I was, I don't know, we do this in my family. I was scratching my mother's head for a quarter as a kid, and this is where she was more apt to talk. And I was scratching her head, and I said, Mama, do we have some Indian in us? And she said, yes, you've got some Indian in you. You've got some Blackfoot, you've got some German, and you've got some French, and you have a little bit of black. And I said, what? How is it that I have a little bit of black, but I've got all these other ethnicities? As a kid, I didn't say ethnicities, but I've got all these other things, but I've never seen these people. We don't have any dream catchers on our wall. We didn't have any, well, we did have horses, but we didn't have anything that was identifiably indigenous or Indian. So, but I held on to the oral history and the oral narrative. 3, you can be adopted into a tribe. Is anyone adopted? Has anyone been adopted into a tribe? Here, yeah. So for example, if you participate in ceremonies, if you are respectful and you're going to these ceremonies and you're working, usually what they don't call it an apprenticeship here, it's basically this person has been around for a long time, meaning you've been around for like 3 or 4 ceremonies, and usually our ceremonies happen within 4-year increments, so you've been around for like 16 years. And maybe that's when someone says, oh, I think that we should like have a ceremony and adopt you into the tribe. And in terms of federal adoption, that won't happen. You don't get any land or anything like that. You won't get that. But you get to have the respect of being a part of the tribe. And I have been adopted into the Aani people, the Gravan of Montana, for various reasons. And then, of course, the other piece is if you're adopted or you marry into the tribe, and then you give birth with your partner who is full-blood indigenous or a quarter indigenous, and then you have these children, and then you also are connected to the tribe and to the nation. So those are some ways that you can be considered Black Indian or Afro-Indigenous. Are there any other ways that you all know that you can be considered Black Indian, or even White Indian? You say, oh, that's a term, White Indian. Yeah, I've danced at some powwows where the people were just look like everybody else, super white, you know, and I'm like, okay, you've got your Cherokee ancestry? Yes, we do. So what happened? What happened where the Black Indian doesn't have a home? And I'm connecting it to I'm trying to connect it to the exhibit that you all have here, Homeland. And I was thinking about, what does that mean to be a person who is bi and triracial, mixed raciality, but you don't actually have a place that you get to call your own? It is similar and akin to African Americans who were African in Africa, and then they were transported all across the North America, Americas, Central America, South America, some parts of Europe, which we don't think about that as well. And then you become something else, something other. So what does that mean when you have been on quote unquote migration or forced removal? How do you find home? And so that's a bit of my research question with writing the book Black Indian, and then also my first book of poetry, Who's Afraid of Black Indians? And there's a bit of a fight behind this, but I'll talk a little bit more about why I wrote that. So free people of color, and then in the 1830s, the First Nations, right, the first indigenous nations of the Southeast being pushed into Indian territory, AKA Oklahoma and Alabama. So this is what some of the journey looked like for some folks. And I'll actually talk a little bit more about the Trail of Tears or the Great Walk or the Trail Where They Cried. But initially it was a pogrom, which Andrew Jackson, I understand Andrew Jackson's papers are here in the archives, which I was like, ooh, I have to go and see this, because he is someone that I love to hate in terms of being an Indian fighter and, you know, essentially him looking at the land and the landscape and saying, if we take those 5 nations that have already assimilated the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, Seminole, if we just say to them, you know, there's a better place for you. We're gonna move you, you know, and so you've already cut your hair, you're already wearing Western clothing, and then you're also already owning slaves. Well, we kind of think there's a better place for you. How does that start? You know, so we're just gonna relocate you. That's a nice way of saying we're going to push you off your territory and your land. So it started in North Carolina and parts of Georgia as well. The Trail of Tears was a walk from the southeast over into the Oklahoma and the Alabama territory. And we have records of how many nations suffered death and loss. One of the things that I have been looking at is how many of the people in those tribes who were the enslaved Black people of the nations, and then how many of them were not enslaved but married into the families who belonged, who were full blood or counted, how many of those were Black and Indigenous and Indian. For me, for my people, when I say this is a family story and family narrative, we came from the North Carolina area. We were on this route where we went to Tennessee, a little bit of Kentucky. One of my matrilineal great-grandmothers was born in Henderson, Kentucky, and then we just kept moving up. So we went to Indiana, where, and my people, the Manuels, the Roberts, the Staffords, Curtises, Matthews. So those are five branches of families that I've been looking at. And Buchanan, that's my father's side, but that's a different book that I'm working on. But for those five families, they settled in different pockets: Cook County, Tennessee, Henderson, Kentucky, and then moving up into Indiana. They started some of the first free people of color settlements in Indiana. So you can look at the Roberts settlement. There's an amazing, they held on to their history. The church is there, the cemetery is there as well. And they just started something called the Heritage Walk. So if you look for the Roberts in Indianapolis, Indiana, you will see how they actually, I'll say how they grew and how they took something in terms of forced removal, and then they thrived. So this is an image of my family. This actually, the one atop the woman, this is my great-grandmother, Frances Caldonia Roberts. That's my grandfather, Clifford Stafford. These are my uncles, Raymond, and why am I blanking on your other name, uncle? I'm so sorry, Raymond. I just learned something about Raymond. I'll come back to my uncle, and then Mildred, and then this is my great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather, Jason Stafford. Jason Stafford, his father was listed as Indian and Black on several records. On his marriage record, marriage record, he was married in Indiana, and they had migrated from North Carolina into Indiana and then into Michigan. The same for Frances Caldonia, or Callie D, they called her. Her people, the Roberts, migrated from North Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, and then Indiana as well. And so when I talk about this as a family memoir, as a tapestry of the country, I can literally see the family and how my family deposited themselves in different parts of this country, and how they had to build communities in order to survive, or they would get, or they moved on for various reasons, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. So this is my auntie and my mom, Aunt Mildred. This is my Aunt Phyllis, and that's my mom right there. Growing up, they called them the Pocahontas fairies, basically because that was all our orientation was. Pocahontas. We didn't know about Tuscarora. We didn't know about any of the nations that we belonged to. We had none of this history until I researched it. And I'm just going to read a little bit from my book, Black Indian, to kind of orient some of the information that I found, which represents apparently that quote-unquote Pocahontas myth that we lived with. My mother's great-grandpa Manuel married Ida Mahoney, and Ida's mom, Mariah Ann Peake, is listed on a family photograph as a full-blood Cherokee, but a later pedigree chart from Great Aunt Catherine lists Mariah as both Delaware, Cherokee, and Pequot Indian born in Oklahoma. The manual men were full or mixed blood Kahari, Noose Indians from Sampson County, North Carolina. They'd either married Indian or Black or other mixed race women like Ida. My great Aunt Catherine was the first one to handwrite a family tree that showed the names and dates and ethnicities in her spider-like scrawl. I traced the rest like an explorer using her genealogical treasure map. My mother's grandmother, Caldonia Frances Stafford Roberts, a Roberts by birth, was 1/4 Cherokee. Caldonia, also known as Callie D, was a descendant of the Roberts settlement, one of the first free people of color settlements in Indiana in 1830. Theirs was a mixed race, bi and triracial community of light, bright people who traded with the Quakers. Roberts' family lore has it that the patriarch James Roberts, born in the mid-1700s, was the son of an American Indian mother and a free African, quote-unquote, servant father who was never a slave. Descriptions of James, a free person of color who owned and sold over 700 acres of land between 1765 and 1809 in Northampton County, North Carolina, confirms his ethnicity. And while the family reported that James's mother was Cherokee, she could really have been Tuscarora or Nottoway or Meherrin, as those were the predominant tribes in the area at that time. And because of the shared experiences in colonial America, interracial marriages between African Americans and American Indians in the 17 and 1800s were the norm, despite prohibitive anti-miscegenation laws. And my Roberts and Staffords are listed in the Guion Miller rolls, the African Eastern Cherokee rolls, a collection of transcribed interviews and recorded letters from 1908 to 1910 from people wanting to receive reparations and land allotments, and they had been promised this in exchange for their already stolen lands. They asserted that their Eastern Cherokee blood was authentic, and I'll stop there. So these are some of the fights that we've been dealing with in terms of how do we get to claim who we are without being persecuted. And literally, I have heard stories about signs that say no Negroes, no Indians, no dogs. Has anyone seen any signs like that? Or no Blacks, or and I have to say also, no Negroes, no Blacks. There are other names that they have for them. But how do you continue on? How do you persevere? How do you tell your children about some of the things that have happened to your ancestors? Well, sometimes you just forget. This is the part of how do you unearth a memory that has been lost and forgotten, even though the evidence is right here. The evidence is here in Indian country. We have been taught, many of us, not to talk about certain things. That if you say at home that you are indigenous and you have some Indian in you, quote unquote, sometimes we were taught you can't say that out in public. You have to keep these kinds of things at home. But if you were born on a reservation, then of course you get to claim that reservation. But if you know that you were on a reservation and you got pushed off, or you were on a reservation, you decided to move, there were moments when even if you left the reservation, some indigenous nations would say, well, they're gone now, we won't claim them. And that's an experience that I've had, particularly when I went to enroll with the Kahari tribe in North Carolina, which the manuals, my family are Kahari from the North Carolina tribe there, and I went to enroll, and they said, you have all of your ancestors except one. And I said, but you have the rosters and the rolls, so can you tell me who that ancestor is? And they were like, no, I'm sorry, we can't tell you. So I was like, oh. So at that point, it was like, so you know that I'm descended from manuals, and the manuals are in this nation, in this tribe, but you still won't help me. And they're like, no, I'm sorry, you guys left, sorry. But I still have danced at the powwow anyway. These are the issues that we face: erasure, eugenics, paper genocide, and particularly, with that U.S. Census, and I talked a little bit about that. Here are some other historical intersections where you can talk about the African American and American Indian intersections. The first recorded intersection was they call it the insurrection between the insurrection in Haiti, or Hispaniola. So there was a Spanish governor in the 1500s, and he owned black slaves. He also owned indigenous slaves. The indigenous slaves went back to where they came from, where they were gotten, and then they came back and stole the black slaves and took them into the swamplands with them. And they said no. So they called that an insurrection, basically. Like, we are going to save the other oppressed people in this area. We're going to take them. So of course it was considered an insurrection. I talked a little bit about the 5 civilized tribes, and then a lot of people don't know that the 5 civilized tribes owned slaves, which that was a revelation as well when I was doing my research for this piece of information, the 5 civilized tribes, and then also looking at the African Holocaust. And I was thinking how 2 branches of my family have been in holocausts, in a decimation, in the sense of being owned by something and being taken from a particular place. So that was an interesting moment for me. Of course, the Trail of Tears, and I'll talk a little bit more about that because I've got some statistics, if I can say the word. Buffalo Soldiers, that's another place of intersection. There are many, many places across Indian country where African Americans and American Indians have intersected and become family and become relatives, but I'll talk about these. One of our premier historians, Jack Forbes, is one of the first people to talk about those intersections in a delineated historical way. So his book was the first place that I came across that reference for the 1500 insurrection, which for him, that was the first moment where, again, we say insurrection, but I also say unity, and a place where 2 oppressed peoples come together in order to save each other, in order to make something different out of the oppression or the enslavement. And so he has been someone also who has considered himself definitely Powhatan, Rappahannock, and Lenape. I've also seen that he has also said, I have African ancestry as well. So the 5 civilized tribes, Cherokee, Choctaw, Muskogee Creek, Chickasaw, and the Seminole. From my people, my nation's Eastern Band, trace them down the Eastern Band Cherokee. On my father's side, Choctaw. Choctaw from Okolona, Mississippi. Choctaw is also Chickasaw country, and so that oral history is something that I have held, and I need to find the delineation definitely connected to that Choctaw, but I have a section in the book that I'll read a little bit about as well. So the Trail of Tears, or the Trail Where They Cried, or the Great Walk. And when we look at the numbers, this is what we see. We don't necessarily know if this is a smaller version of it, but you see that of the 20,000 removed Cherokee, 15,000 survived, 5,000 died. Of the 19,600 and 600 removed Creek, 3,500 died. Choctaw, 12,500 removed. So you can see that repetition of the removal and the death, and then who survived. And again, I've been looking at how many of them were Black Indians. And then at the time, do they want to consider themselves Black Indians, or do they just want to consider themselves, I'm a part of this nation, I'm a part of this tribe? However, you still had that delineation of those who, after the Civil War, as a punishment for the Cherokee fighting in the Civil War on the quote-unquote wrong side, they were forced to enroll their Black slaves into the nation. And so that's a contention that has been in the news for the last 10 years of the Cherokee Nation disenrolling their Black members and then re-enrolling their Black members. And so, of course, the word that I haven't said is, yes, there is some racism in Indian country as well. So, and it's a kind of racism that has been taught to us, and it's something that many of us in certain areas have had to unlearn. But of course, you have to identify it. So of the 70,000 indigenous or Indians, along with their Black slaves, who were approximately, we say again, 10% of that total, forced into the new quote-unquote Indian territory. Again, estimated between 11,000, 16,000 indigenous men, women, and children died on the trail, and over 8,000, estimate to 10 Black enslaved people went with them, and how many were we? And so there's a section in the book that I really wanted I wanted the numbers. I wanted to know how many. And so I have this section, where is it, 90, 65, okay. Before the 5 civilized tribes were forced to leave their homes and tribal lands in the southeast, many of them had assimilated in order to save themselves, to keep their land. They cut their hair, wore Western clothing, and adopted white ways to make whites feel safer around Native Americans. They owned hundreds of slaves who were walked with them during the Great Removal in Indian Territory, to Indian Territory in Oklahoma and Alabama. So here are the numbers. Casting a blight on this tale is, in 1833, the US Census showed that among the Creek nations, that population of 22,000, roughly 22,000, they held 902 Black slaves. In 1835, census showed that among the 16,542 Cherokee, they owned 1,592 Black slaves. The numbers of slaves owned only increased until the end of the Civil War, when the tribes had to grant their Black or mixed blood slaves full tribal rights and citizenry. Cherokee bands who owned both Black and Indigenous slaves sometimes exhibited the most anti-Black policies, passing laws that prevented Blacks and Cherokees from marrying, as well as Black slaves from owning property. The Chickasaw were reportedly the most vicious slave masters, treating their Black slaves just like the white plantation masters, who likened their slaves and even their own mixed race kids to animals. I've seen documentation that shows that. After the Civil War, the Chickasaw were the only Indian tribe that did not immediately free their slaves. And I'll stop there. So this kind of history is something that, going back to the beginning of it, it's when I say, where are your people from? And I start thinking about land loss, interaction, who came together, who were the ones who were fighting, who were the ones who tried to show unity, who were the ones who owned the people. When we talk about erasure, this is such an important text. It's interesting. So after the quote unquote, the 5 civilized tribes were settled in Indian Territory, many people, full blood and mixed race people said, we're Indian. We need to let you all know that we're Indian and we would like our land allotment. And so they said, well, how do we know that you're Indian? You weren't on the Trail of Tears. We didn't write you down in the rolls. The Creeks have their own rolls. The Cherokee have a roll. The Dawes rolls. So your name's not there. So how do we do this? So they sent someone, Guion Miller, into the community, and they said, okay, anyone who claims their indigeneity from the southeast area, apply, like fill out an application. Tell us how you think you're Indian. And so this happened 1906 to 1911, the African Cherokee rolls, AKA the Guion Miller rolls. So they interviewed and got letters from 125,000 mixed race and full bloods. I actually have some uncles on here, and the uncle is saying, in the text he says, and it's written colloquially, it's written in a dialect, and it says, we is some kin to the Cherokees from, and it lists where they're from, and my uncle always said, so they're working off of the oral history and the oral narrative. So that information, those letters were listed here, and then after they got all these letters and information, they said, well, you can't actually prove it, and we think that you might have been a slave, not counting the fact that they could have been a slave within the tribes. So they said, we don't know, we can't codify this, we can't actually prove your indigeneity. And so they only approved 32,000 applications. And so what happens to the rest of those mixed race, full blood, or folks who migrated or relocated or who were forced? Bless you, what happens to those people? We just continue our oral narrative and our oral heritage. You can actually find the Guion Miller rolls on the National Archives website. If you're interested in seeing that, maybe some of your people are listed there, but all 5 branches of my family are listed there. Another really, really interesting moment in American history is when Walter Pleckard, how many of you have heard of Walter Pleckard? Anyone? The first Virginia magistrate. So Walter Pleckard was a known white supremacist. He was a part of a group of politicians and political people who believed in the inferiority of anyone who was not white. And when he became the Virginia magistrate, the first Virginia magistrate, his job was to go into the records and send his people into the records. And you can see him here. Anyone who listed on their records that they were more than one race, they would become black. That's the one drop rule. If you said you were black and Indian or black and white, you just became black. And if you said you were indigenous and white, they could decide whether or not you would get your indigeneity or whether or not you would be considered white on your birth certificate, on your death certificate, on your marriage certificate. Again, another pogrom, right? Paper genocide. He was firing, Pleckard actually would fire people if they complained and they said, I don't want to do this, right? So again, here you have just erasing the black and the Indian and the mulatto. And this is where finally they said, you know, we're only gonna have two races. We're gonna have colored, we're gonna have black. Can you imagine all those indigenous tribes in Virginia, the ones who were trading with the first kings and queens who came to Jamestown, and so wait, Pocahontas's people are only colored? The Powhatan Nation, the Confederacy, the Iroquois, the Algonquin, they're only colored? How is that possible that we get to write a law that strips people of their ancestry and heritage and their lands, right? And the last one is one of the reasons that they did it, because if you don't have a tribe, the name of a tribe associated with a landscape, then you kind of get to take the land. So if you say, oh no, you're colored, oh, you're listed as colored, we listed you as colored. It's like, no, that's my land over there, I'm Kahari, I'm Tuscarora, I'm from this area. And it's like, we just have you colored, as colored, right? And so, again, here's a moment in history where the law creates or created the way in which society begins to interact with mixed race peoples who consider themselves black and indigenous. And this is what it looked like, a different kind of Jim Crow, right? So this is a creation, the registration of birth and color in Virginia. You had to list the name, your birth, and then this is where they have you list the colored. Right. Or if you listed black and indigenous, then they would, again, they would change it and they would make you usually black. One of the reasons as well, he said that we can't tell the difference when we physically go to a tribe or we go to someplace and we can't see that they're a different color. We can't tell whether or not they're black or whether or not they're indigenous. So we're just gonna make it easier for us and we're just gonna call you colored. Another thing that happened with the colored and the colored only, white only, many of the indigenous schools, it was wonderful to create indigenous schools that educated indigenous people, but that was another moment where they would go into schools and they would say, you will only get federal monies if you have no black people in your schools. And so documents started to be produced to say, we have no Negro blood. We have no Negroes in here. And there are reports where families say, we were going to school with our cousins and then suddenly we were not. We were in the same schoolhouse, the one-room schoolhouse with our cousins, and suddenly we were not because they were separating us. They wouldn't give money to the school. And somehow some education had to be preserved in that nation, in that tribe. But we're still here. Throughout all of this, the Black Choctaw, the Black Seminole, Creek, we're still here despite all of this erasure and attempts to say that we are not who we are. Another moment in history is when the Buffalo Soldiers served after the Civil War, and they essentially were paid to go out and fight American Indians, and they were very, the lore has it that they were successful, right? Just kind of vicious. And the story is they were called the Buffalo Soldiers because a Comanche said their hair was like buffalo, and that's how they became the Buffalo Soldiers. when we're growing up, we don't get this kind of history. We don't get this kind of information, particularly for me. How many of you knew about the Buffalo Soldiers fighting in civil wars? Did you all think that they were already indigenous? That they weren't? Okay, some people said, no, we didn't think Buffalo Soldiers, but some people think, oh, they're just indigenous. It's like, no, they were paid to go out and to fight the indigenous people, and some of them did not come back. Some of them decided that they wanted to stay and marry and have children with some of the indigenous women in those areas. Yeah. So this is something else that I talk about, the Black, Indian, Afro-Indigenous people hiding in plain sight or in history. And let me ask the question as I'm talking, does anyone know why do we have to hide? Why do we have to hide from, why do we have to be people in our communities not talking about being indigenous? Anyone want to answer that question? No. Yes. I saw a half a hand. Yeah. No, that wasn't a hand. Okay, no. Anyone? All right. I'll keep talking. Why do we have to hide? And let me read this piece. This is one of the reasons. Grandpa Stafford, this is my grandfather. My Grandpa Stafford pretended to farm, but mostly, besides drinking, he sold live bait, robust worms, spiny crawdads, anything that the fish in the surrounding lakes would swallow. On breezy days, the scent of the bait, sometimes making like 3-day-old roadkill, would hover over the farm. My grandfather hated himself. He did not want to be considered Black. My grandfather would take the children and he would say, look, you are indigenous. Do not call yourselves Black. One of my great aunts would say the same thing. She would not call herself Black. She would call herself indigenous and white. And this is the kind of narrative that we grew up with in our family as well. I'm just going to read one more piece from the story, from the narrative, and this is my Grandpa Tone, great-grandpa Tone. This is the story from one of my uncles at my father's funeral, who essentially came to me and he said, you know, your great-grandfather had an African wife and an Indian wife. As the lore goes on my father's side of the family, my great-grandfather, Grandpa Tone, had 2 wives in Okolona, Mississippi. He had an African wife and a Choctaw wife who lived down the street from each other with their own separate families. These 2 sets of families produced 2 different but shared bloodlines. My Uncle Blue told me at my father's funeral, Grandpa Tone spent half his time at one house with the African family and the other half at the Indian wife's house. Those were the days. No one asked them for tribal enrollment cards or blood pedigrees. Was my Grandpa Tone a slave or full-blood Indian? No one knew, but I have his story. Sometimes Black folks give me the look when I say I am American Indian as well as African American. It's simple, I think, 50-50, like 2 sides of a coin. Girl, please. I get the neck roll and the corresponding roll of the eyes. You know you Black, or everybody got some Indian in them. Don't get uppity. Everybody got some Indian in them? Not everybody. And not as many as we think, according to historian Henry Louis Gates Jr. And his work in genealogy, where he basically says very few African Americans possess American Indian ancestry based off their sheer disproportionate ratio of Africans to Indians in the New World. But my red-Black friends disagree with his hypothesis vehemently. In fact, I think he started his show based off of this idea, the concept where red-Blacks were fighting back, against him, and they were saying, "You're not a genealogist." And I believe that this show actually began because he said, "Wait a minute, I'm going to start tracing people. I'm going to find out where people actually are from." But Henry Louis Gates is a renowned historian, so I will not. I'm not going to ding Henry Louis Gates, but I will say, how does he know? How does he know if yes, he's interviewing a lot of people, but how does he know who actually has that blood until there's a quantifiable way to test the blood? So if you say, I have the oral history of my grandmother, of my grandfather, and that appears to be 1/8 if you've done your DNA test. Or if you say, I have this ancestry from my great-grandmother, great-grandfather, and it's 7 generations back or 8 generations back. Can I claim my indigeneity? Can I still claim that? Some people will say, yes, you can claim it. Some people will say, well, if you've never practiced this way, if you've never participated in a ceremony, why would you want to claim it now? So there's a romance to the claiming of some of that indigeneity, and it's something that, in my experience, I've kind of been fighting against on both the African American side sometimes, and then on the American Indian side as well. So again, I just said, why should I hide, who I am and what I do and that oral history, and then I've done the research, why should I hide? There were moments when I was taking my family records to powwows, just in case someone wanted to challenge me, and someone wanted to say, you're not indigenous, you're not Indian, why are you dancing in the powwow circle? And I had one of my grandfather's World War I records that said he was Indian. And then finally I said, why am I doing this? Why do I have to prove it? This is the way in which we have been taught. You have to prove that mixed raciality. You have to be able to claim that, because you are taking up space of people which, and the space in which full-blood American Indians have been relegated to is such an interesting space, depending on that piece of history in this country. And I don't want to take up space, but at the same time, there's a moment where you get to say, I'm not taking up space, I'm actually participating in what was already laid out for me. And I think other people, when I say, why hide? William Loren Katz, he is one of the first premier historians to say, wait a minute, I've been doing all this research in the wild, wild West. I've been pulling all of this history together, but I see all these connections between African Americans and American Indians. I see that one of the first rodeo riders, Bill Pickett, which I have a picture of him, Bill Pickett was Black and Cherokee. I see where some of the African, quote unquote, the Black people, if you call them Negro or colored, they also have an indigenous grandfather, or they participate in ceremonies. So he was one of the first people to say, you know what, let's actually celebrate this history and this heritage. Diana Fletcher, she is someone who has haunted me before she became the cover on my book, Who's Afraid of Black Indians. They say that her father was born a slave, later a runaway slave, that he went to Florida and married a Seminole woman, and that this mother died on the Trail of Tears, right? Also, they say that she went to Hampton Institute, which is, I taught at Hampton University for 13 years. I've never seen a plaque or anything that says, this is where Diana Fletcher came from, but there's a lore behind her. Diana Fletcher, the regalia that she has on, after the father remarried, they say he married a Kiowa woman, and the Kiowa stepmother taught her how to make her regalia. So how do you connect this information and the history and the lore? And people have researched it, and they say they can't actually find her, but there's evidence right here. So if she's not called Diana Fletcher, she looks like a dark-skinned Afro-Indigenous woman who is dressed in her regalia. That's evidence to me, even if you can't actually find that connection. So Diana Fletcher. This is another wonderful book that talks about the moments where we, Afro-Indigenous peoples, have been splintered apart by laws, maybe even by moving away from a family, maybe even changing your name, changing the last part of your name so that you can become something else when you get to a new state, indivisible. And they did a fantastic exhibit at the Smithsonian Institute of this book several years ago. Another really interesting piece of history that I never got taught, and I don't know if anyone else got taught this, but Crispus Attucks. And Crispus Attucks was the first man to die in what we call America's Revolutionary War, but he was also indigenous. So, and I want to make sure I'm saying the name correctly, Negaraset. Am I saying that correctly? I always add, it's like a Michigan thing, I always add the Nagarasat. I add a long A to everything, it's crazy. But so Nagarasat, they say his mom was indigenous, Wampanoag, and that the father was black. So why only relegate him to a space of just being an African American person and not having all of his ancestry, right? Why relegate him to that space? Why do we have to hide? Why are we hiding that? That's a question. Mildred Loving, how many of you know who Mildred Loving is? Mildred Loving, who married Richard Loving, and they took, so they married secretly in Mississippi, came back to Virginia, and as soon as they crossed the line to get back into Virginia, they were arrested because it was illegal to marry for blacks and a white person to marry. And so she was jailed for, the story is that she was jailed for 2 weeks, I think, and Richard Loving, her husband, maybe was in jail for like 2 or 3 days. But there was something, of course, happening with regards to the inequality of being incarcerated. So Mildred Loving was considered colored. So when you think back to the cutting off of the free people of color who, quote, some maybe bought themselves out of enslavement or were never enslaved. And in 1924, when all the people of color became colored, and then there were only white people, if you said she was colored, and colored is synonymous with black, then you would think Mildred Loving is a black person. And later she said, I'm Rappahannock, and I've always been Rappahannock, but we couldn't claim that. We couldn't claim it. And even you can see, if you actually look on Facebook, her son, one of her sons was saying, my mother was full blood Rappahannock. She was never black. Her people were never enslaved, black people. But we have these kinds of figures hiding in plain sight in history. So, and then also another figure, Edmania Lewis, was the first African American and Native American sculptor, one of the first to achieve this international recognition, father black, mother Chippewa or Ojibwe. So again, you have these incredible, incredible people. And I wanted to, Chief John Horse, another one, fought 2 Seminole Wars. Those are Black Indians at Hampton University. And I wanted to show you this for those of you who are younger and who might have an interest in this, that Beyonce claims her Cherokee and Irish and black blood. So did anyone not know that? Some people, okay, all right. Some people are, yeah, I didn't know that. Jimi Hendrix claimed his ethnicity, the biraciality. The man who invented potato chips in upstate New York, George Speck, right? Mohawk. Langston Hughes considered himself mixed race, mixed indigenous. Rosa Parks. We can go on and on. Alice Walker, Nina Simone considered herself black and indigenous. Yeah, we can go on. And then Pharrell, black and indigenous. This is a really interesting story. Redmina Cody is the first black, we'll say black Navajo, but she became the first Miss Navajo who happened to be a black person. And she says that she was raised with her grandmother. Her grandmother taught her the Navajo ways or Dene ways. And when she won Miss Navajo, she faced so much appreciation from some people. She also faced so much racism when they were saying, you're not Navajo, you can't represent us. Why couldn't she represent them if she was raised with her grandmother, if she has that connection, that history, and that blood? James Earl Jones, Bill Pickett, Augusta Savage. Yeah. So where is home for us? I started this with the song. And for me, when I think about holding on to those ancestries and that oral history and that oral narrative, song becomes a place where I identify myself. And drumming and participating in indigenous ceremonies. I am a women's traditional dancer. So home becomes for me standing behind the men on the drum and singing with them. Or home becomes when I can cross an Indian country and land in a spot where I know no one, but if someone says, there's a ceremony happening over there, and it's like, oh, let me go over there to South Dakota to this side, and let me go over here and participate in this ceremony, that becomes home for me. Home for me is bringing my heritage and my culture and my tradition into the room no matter where I go. So when we say where is home for us, it is what we pass down. It is what we tell our children, and it's also hopefully if you have those records that you can produce to show that, this becomes a part of that home for me particularly. Oh yes, and home is the Nottoway tribe in Virginia. So this is Chief Lynette. She is an amazing historian woman, brought the Nottoway tribe to the prominence that it is in Virginia right now. And I was at their powwow in September. She was just crowned Queen of Nottoway, like Queen Nottoway. So like we would say Pocahontas is like Princess Pocahontas. Lynette is now Queen of Nottoway, the Queen of Nottoway. Our heritage matters. Our ancestors and ancestry will not be erased. And also, I love to say that memory and these kinds of talks, this becomes resistance. This is the best kind of resistance sometimes, particularly in a country where many things are being erased right now. Thank you. Wado miigwech, chimiigwech. Thank you. Did I talk a little too long? Okay, sorry, okay.
We'll now open the floor up for questions, if anyone has questions.
Yes.
Yeah, did you ever think of, instead of a memoir, writing a novel or a poem, as other writers have done?
Like who?
Rita Dove, Amy Tan, Nikki Giovanni.
Yeah. That's a great question. So I did write a book of poetry. This is the first feeling of there's so much information and there's so much history that I have that's not out there, that I've never been taught. So book of poetry first. The book of poetry spawned the memoir, but also what's happening in my memoir is there is a sense of the family enacting a heritage that they had no idea they had inherited. So there is we don't have a sense of, were we on the Trail of Tears? No, we didn't have that. My family did not know that they were on the migration trail. We always thought we were from Kalamazoo, Michigan, Matawan, Michigan, born and raised. We had no idea of the migration. We had no idea of any of this. And so I wanted to bring this together in a way that showed how my family, we were enacting some really violent things, violent ways, but why? We didn't know who we were. We didn't know where we came from. We had not inherited anything that would help us in the way that we needed help. The other piece, it's interesting that you say, why don't you, you said, did you think about writing a poem or a novel? I'm working on a novel as well, because sometimes people receive fiction differently than they receive these kinds of stories. I will say that I took out at least half of the history. My editor said, you've got too much history in here, and we need this to be a memoir. It's gotta be a narrative. So I took out half the history, which that'll be in another book. Thank you for asking that.
Yes, thank you.
Should we sit next? Or no, are we good to stand up? I'm okay. If you're okay, I'm good.
Any other questions?
Yes.
So I know you mentioned paper genocide and also oral traditions, and so I was wondering how people who felt like they had indigenous blood but who grew up hearing oral traditions and couldn't find those papers, like how would they look into discovering their past, like they had indigenous family?
Yeah. Well, how could you find that? The first place you start is with the eldest people in your family. So whoever the great grandparents, the great aunts, grandfathers, family who came to reunions, start with them first. What do you remember? Where are you from? Where did you go to school? Do you know who your people are? So asking questions first of the people who are alive, get that information, because they say, of course, when an older person dies, the history of the family dies with them if you haven't asked them any questions. Second, then you can start going to the places that your family were born and raised, and you can look at the where did they live, what was happening around them, what kind of racism was happening, could they go to school, could they not go to school, were they getting jobs in this area, were they not getting jobs in this area, did they build a school, what did they build, so what kind of community did they erect themselves, and you can start looking at the state census documents. You can start looking at birth certificates, marriage certificates, death certificates, anything that shows where they lived, where they died, where they married. Those are the kinds of things that start to create a story and a narrative if they didn't already have one. And there's a lot more. The National Archives, but it takes a while to learn to like navigate the National Archives. Some people are at genealogy societies. We in North Carolina has a Raleigh, North Carolina. They have an archives there. Indianapolis, they have a fantastic library that has an archives there as well. So there are pockets of archives across the country, and they will help you. Thank you for that question. Thank you all so much for being here. Yes.
There were two.
Yes.
Dr. Nunley and
Yes.
Dr. Isaac.
Hello, thank you so very much for your talk. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask more about Henry Gates' claim. Dr. Gates claimed that in many instances, African Americans, when they think of ancestry, mention Cherokee grandmother as their ancestor, and that claim that he made was that that's not he actually said not indigenous heritage, it's European heritage,
Yes.
most likely.
Yes.
And I recall him saying that, and I found that profound.
Yes.
My question is, maybe I should say this. I also felt that there's a history that might be explained differently in different spaces where there are communities that are interacting differently. And I wanted to ask you how that bears out in American history or in certain areas, and Virginia in particular.
Yes. So how the information, how it bears differently in terms of the European piece,
Or just, we'll say mixed race ancestry period, which might actually be indigenous, European, and African, especially in Virginia. Because that's what I was thinking. I was like, clearly, he's not thinking about Virginia.
So I have a joke that I say I am Black, indigenous, and white, but the white people never showed up to the family reunions. So I don't know like who you are. However, if I look at my grandfather actually passed for white. One of my grandfather's brothers disappeared into white society and married a white woman, never to be found again. And my aunt told me a story of walking down the street holding the manual who said I'm still Black, and seeing his brother on the other side of the street, and they did not talk to each other. So they draw lines, and they draw lines for protection as well. Because if you are a person who's passing, you're Black and indigenous, or Black, indigenous, and white, and you are passing in this community, and if someone outs you, then you could lose everything, you could be murdered. I mean, that's just the way it was. I say was, and I want to make sure that I don't have a contemporary reference for it, because there's so many interesting things happening right now. But that's the way it was back then. In terms of Gates not understanding the history of Virginia nations and tribes, and the tributes and the tributary, and then also the Cherokee having delegations go to Europe. Pocahontas went to Europe. So there are interactions. Pocahontas, actually, her bones are still buried in Graves Inn in England, and they will not release the bones. But the interactions of indigenous people and Europeans and the Black people has always been happening. But there is a sense of some things we can't actually talk about, we can't delineate, and then that's why we write. That's why we write these kinds of, hopefully, history books that give us some sense of delineating the history, but memoir as well, in terms of the history is here, this is what I found, this is how we react and act in our families because of what I found. And this is how the country interacts with us. This is how society, I can say the word society, interacts with us. And then sometimes they'll interact with you differently when you say certain things. And for me, again, I go back to I'm not hiding. I'm not hiding anymore. I was taught as a child, you don't say this outside, but when I started bringing the information home And one of our, the Kalamazoo Gazette has an article that says the first mixed race families of Kalamazoo are the Staffords and the Manuels and the Roberts. My brother ripped the piece of paper from me and ran to his kids and said, "Look, I told you we were Indian. You know, I told you we had this information, rather this blood." So the way people interact with that knowledge is different in different spaces and different times of their lives. Did I answer your question? Because Gates, I don't know if he can go and test all of Virginia. That would be interesting. He could make that one of his projects.
Dr. I.
Thank you. Wonderful presentation, by the way. I appreciate it. I do research on Hebrew studies. And, oh, you can't hear me?
No, you do research on, we're going to bring a mic to you.
Okay. You know what? I'm sorry, I'm naturally soft-spoken.
That's okay. Let's see.
Thank you. Oh, wow. I do research on Hebrew Israelites, okay? And I'm thinking about it in connection with your presentation. It was a wonderful presentation, by the way. That's what I wanted to say. But you kept using this phrase that I wanted to ask. I wanted to, kind of mine your brain a little bit to see what you're referring to. You kept using this phrase called indigenous ceremonies. And I wanted to ask you what that was. Because in the communities we work with, I don't know how to explain it, but there's like 3 different groups, right? There's the people that are like bona fide. I'm just pulling an example, right? There's members of the Cherokee Nation. And then there's Cherokee people. And amongst those Cherokee people, you may find Afro-Indigenous people. And then there's these other people over here, no documentation, completely different discourse, doing different traditions that they claim are genealogically connected to the first 2 communities. So my question is, amongst communities that come from histories like yours, from those Afro-Indigenous communities, what would you say the relationship is between families like yours and these other Black populations that I'm assuming Henry Louis Gates is talking about, that, you see what I'm saying, are disconnected historically? That's the question.
I think for me, I set myself on the trail to find the ancestry, to find that connection. It was of the utmost importance to my identity as someone who was always considered light-skinned, and the colorism piece was huge in my family. And I was like, so why does my aunt, who is light bright, not like the blacks, the darker skinned Black folks in the family? So I set myself on the path to find that ancestry, and it was, okay, so who do I know? I knew my grandfather. I did not know my grandfather's mother or his father. That history was gone. My mother never spoke my great-grandfather and grandmother's name. I had to find them. And then I kept going and kept going and kept going until I said, wait a minute, the Manuels are from the Sampson County, North Carolina area. What are the tribes in that area? So I was like doing that detective investigative work. Same for the Staffords. And I said, okay, the Staffords, they're from Hertford, North Carolina. Hertford, North Carolina, the Meharans have a tribe, and it's Tuscarora too. So I'm literally going, a Black person, going to the places, doing this research to find the trail, to find the heritage. And so what I hear you saying is, what makes me different and my people different from other people who didn't do this kind of work? My family doesn't do these ceremonies. I do these ceremonies because I'm celebrating the ancestry that I've researched, that I know we have. They do a thing, my family, we do Thanksgiving, we do Christmas, we do traditional Western ceremonies, we do everything else. The family that I have culled and created, we do sweat lodges, we do pipe ceremonies, and so I know these are traditions that have been passed down for hundreds of years. I'll say hundreds, maybe some people will say thousands, but hundreds of years that I know. And if I know I'm with someone who, in a ceremony, who can say that their great grandfather did this before removal, or their great grandfather or grandmother did this, or this is how we used to prepare it, then I know I'm getting more information. I'm getting closer to what it used to look like for my family when they were here. And so I celebrate, and I try to bring some of them with me. I took my aunt to a powwow last month, I think, my aunt and my cousins. And as soon as my auntie had never gone to a powwow, my cousin had never gone to a powwow, but me, I have my shawl, I have my ribbon skirt on, and as soon as we sat down, I was like, okay, you guys good, are you good? And I put on my shawl and I started dancing in the circle, and my cousin was like, oh my God, I can't believe you did that. I was like, I've been doing this for many, many years, and I'm participating in a culture that actually is yours too. You just have not found, I'll say this, you didn't do the research, and you don't practice that way. You just don't do that. That's not a ceremony that they practice, even though they have the heritage. And so for the Black Israelites, the Black Hebrews, I don't know why they claim Hebrew or Israelite. I'm not well versed in that piece of it. I would assume that some of them have traced their ancestry to areas in Israel. And then they decided that they have a connection there. But for me, it was setting myself on that path and then bringing the information back to my community, to my family. My mother would say, that's so nice that you do that. That you do that. That's so nice that you do that. That's what my mom said, yeah. Any other? Yeah.
So I know you mentioned tourism a lot, and my mom grew up experiencing that as well as like a Mexican African American woman. And so, are there any instances that really impacted you with that tourism within your familial group?
Mm-hmm. So, two things. My great Aunt Catherine would not comb my hair because I had a kitchen. So we had this is the kitchen. Sorry, I'm telling people who don't have kitchens what a kitchen is, but it's like really knotty hair at the back of your nape, and so we call that the kitchen. My great Aunt Catherine was like, no, I'm sorry, I can't comb your hair. It's too nappy. That's one instance. Another instance is when I was singing on a drum, a powwow drum, and my white Indian friend, she's Navajo and white, and I said something to her. Oh, someone brought me a picture, and they said, oh, this is Harriet Tubman. I thought you would really like Harriet Tubman. I was like, okay, thank you, because I'm Black and Indian. She got so mad, and she said, you're not Black. I was like, but I am. I'm not gonna deny the Black so you can feel more comfortable in your indigeneity. As a white Indian, I'm not gonna deny my Blackness just to fit into your idea of what an Indian looks like. And so I've had that across Indian country, I have to say, and in some places, it's just, are you respectful? Do you practice these ceremonies in a respectful way? Do you know how to do this? Who are your teachers? Who taught you? I'm like, okay, I know how to do this. I know when to be quiet. I know when to ask, can I help? And then other places, I haven't had this a lot, but other places I can see where people will look you up and down first. And they're like, oh, does she belong here? I don't look like I belong in certain places until I say something, and then they're like, oh, she knows. Oh, okay, she can come and participate in this ceremony because of the way she says a thing. It's so interesting. Intonation counts a lot. Showing up, intonation, and being respectful counts a lot in Indian country. Yeah. Did I answer your question? Okay. Colorism is a huge piece. It's a huge deal.
We have about 3 more minutes, so Dr. Nunley, do you want to do the last?
Thank you so very much. Yes, I was just wondering if you could share more about multiraciality and the claims that are being made by the Lumbee in North Carolina and seeking federal recognition, and how if African ancestry is an impasse for them in becoming recognized.
So I do know some Lumbee. I have been on their tribal lands. I have not gone to a powwow there. They have always, the people that I know have always said that we have been one of the largest mixed race tribes before we started counting. So essentially it was Black, it was Indigenous, and it was white. They have always been multicultural and multiracial. That's what they said. The people that I know have said. Some of them also consider themselves the first Croatan, and so some you can see some of them have tattoos, which represents being the first Croatan. The Croatan are the first indigenous tribes that supposedly the first settlers met in the North Carolina area. So some of them said we're the first Croatan as well. In terms of where they are now, I know as a nation, as a representative, I'm going to make sure I'm saying this correctly. What I have heard is that the nation said that they were voting for Trump, and that they basically were supporting Trump. And when I heard that, I was like, but you're the largest, to my understanding, the largest multiracial, tribe in the country, and you're supporting this person who does not support people of color, BIPOCs, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So, to my understanding, the multiculturalism is a thing that they were proud of, that they're continually proud of, but it's a little incongruent if you support someone like that who is about to kind of erase your traditions and try to, if he could, take your land and just kick you back to the 18th century, 17th century actually, or 1790s, when you could start to erase tribes off of federal documents. So I'm sorry, I don't want to put that out there just so that he'll start thinking about doing that. But yeah, that's a kind of a truism. So that's what I've heard. They consider themselves multicultural, multiracial, but if you are enrolled in the Lumbee tribe, you still consider yourself Lumbee. You get to say, I'm Lumbee. Did I answer your question? I hope so. Okay. That's it. Thank you very much, everyone. I'm very grateful.